Hello, welcome to the first Sunday Salon talk of the 2021 season. Our 18th, can you imagine, reimagined to stream on Zoom. I'm Lisa Fox Martin, the chair of the Board of Trustees, and although I miss terribly not being able to see you in person in the Thomas Cole new studio, hopefully next year we'll all be together again. I want to turn this over to Betsy Jacks, our wonderful executive director, who will now introduce our speaker. So thank you so much for joining us today, and hopefully we'll all be together again next year in person. Bye.
Thank you, Lisa, our wonderful chairman of the board. Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Sunday Salons. The purpose of this series is to bring new information, newly uncovered research on topics that show how very relevant American history is for today's time. I hope you will join me for these speakers once a month from January through April. So today, I'd like to start by dedicating this series to the memory of a very special person, our longtime friend and supporter, David Gray, who passed away at the end of December. Many of you will remember David, who with his wife Laura was a regular presence at our events, an early sponsor of this series, a passionate collector, and the generous donor who gave us an important Thomas Cole painting a few years ago. We miss him very much, and I know he would have loved to be here with us today. The remarkable story you are about to hear actually began 20 years ago when a different historic restoration specialist became involved with the Thomas Cole National Historic Site. A woman with encyclopedic knowledge of historic preservation techniques, materials, styles, finishes, you name it, as well as a great generosity, donating her time and expertise to us as an extraordinary board member. I'm speaking, of course, of Carrie Fetter, without whom we might still believe that Thomas Cole lived in a spare farmhouse with white walls. Thank you, Carrie, for leading us with authenticity in historic restoration. It was Carrie, in fact, that introduced us to today's speaker, Jean Dunbar. Jean is the expert in historic interiors who's been researching and restoring Cole's home with us since 2008. She also worked on George Washington's Mount Vernon, Montpelier, and so many others. With Jean's help, we learned in 2014, for example, that Thomas Cole had painted directly onto the plaster walls of his home in Catskill, a discovery that was announced by Senator Schumer and reported in the New York Times shortly after that. Since then, we have only learned more and more about this unstudied aspect of Thomas Cole. And today we will hear the latest chapter in this unfolding story. So I'm so pleased to bring you Jean Dunbar. Here she is.
Good afternoon, and welcome to the first ever presentation of a Sunday Salon from an undisclosed location in Southwest England. After two previous attempts to give this talk, one derailed by a blizzard and the other by the pandemic, I'm trying again, and I'm doing it as recorded remarks, and then if all goes according to plan, we'll have the opportunity to talk and discuss questions once I'm able to come and actually be part of this in person later in the afternoon. The origin of this particular talk is the origin of the original project that has been ongoing for a dozen years and more. My brief was to investigate Cedar Grove as it looked and felt and functioned in its arguably happiest years from 1836 to 1848, when Thomas Cole and his wife Mariah and their children lived in the house, sharing it with Mariah's extended family. This was quite a project initially because virtually everything in the house that could have told us what it looked like had been either covered with paint or removed or confused in some fashion. So it was really a delight to find a scrap of carpet that had been used to reupholster Thomas Cole's painting chair. It turned out to be a piece of carpet that had originally been in the west parlor. I was able to determine that because I found actual accounting in which Thomas Cole was compensated for the purchase of the carpet, and also at the same time for buying 28 yards of calico to do bed hangings for the Coles bedroom. All of this part of a decorative campaign. The timing of these initial efforts was fairly clear. We knew that the Coles had married in 1836, moved into Cedar Grove in 1837, that their son Theodore was born the first day of 1838. By 1839, Cole was paying for the carpet, and in between that time and the birth of Theodore Cole, presumably the west parlor was painted, both with a beautiful wall color devised by Cole and also an elegant and exquisite painted frieze executed by him. In fact, it turned out that Thomas Cole had designed and executed complete decorative schemes for both of Cedar Grove's two parlors, both the west, which you see here, and the east, and that the friezes that were painted at the upper walls of these rooms owed a great deal to Thomas Cole's early years as a designer of fabrics, printed fabrics, and wallpapers. Here you can see some of those affinities. The decoration also drew on his experience in America as a designer of wallpaper and a decorator of manufactured products. The frieze above is the frieze from the East Parlor. Below are two wallpaper friezes that are closely related to it. In the end of what seemed to be our research phase into the house, it then appeared that what we had was a situation in which Cole had decorated two rooms, presumably as a setting for paintings and collections. There was some indication as well that the look of the rooms was influenced both by manufactured products on the left and also, as you see on the upper right, by Roman wall painting, in this case a blue peacock, very similar to the blue peacocks in the carpet. Cole's work as a designer in the cotton industry had introduced him to ancient Roman style and also its impact on modern popular taste in the form of neoclassicism. We also discovered quickly that Thomas Cole had visited Pompeii, Herculaneum, and Paestum. And in this phase of the project, it was my assumption that his interest in things Pompeian and the appearance of the rooms was perhaps heavily indebted to his visit to those cities. Here the story might have ended, but it didn't, because fast forward, there was recently a historic structures report of the house was commissioned, which necessitated some more finishes analysis. Matthew Mosca, the team's finishes consultant, came in, and with the help of Margaret Soliski, who's conservator working with the Thomas Cole National Historic Site, there was investigation made of a room that had had absolutely no interest for us previously, but simply because it was part of the study. This was the room we knew as Alexander Thompson's room or Uncle Sandy's bedroom, a small room at the back of the main floor with no appreciable interest. However, Margaret and Matthew's work soon revealed a complex paint scheme in this small room with a strong Pompeian flavor and a very bold frieze. Moreover, the frieze that appeared in this room, unlike the ones in the other rooms, does not actually imitate wallpaper. It has dentils and meander like wallpapers and the imitations that Cole used in the other rooms, but it's integrated with the wall painting, so refers to ancient Roman decoration, not to modern neoclassical design. This completely transformed our view of what was happening at Cedar Grove. If you factor in the painting of this room, it then appears that what Cole created was not two decorated parlors as settings for pictures, but an ensemble of painted rooms, an interior intended to be an entire direct experience in which you could move from room to room, each one exquisitely painted and with its own atmosphere. Thus, the question asked by the project has changed, and now we ask, what inspired Thomas Cole to create a totally immersive experience at Cedar Grove? Why on earth did he do that instead of decorating? In part, he was simply reflecting the enthusiasms of his time. There was a craze for experience. The Grand Tour is a perfect example of this. People went from place to place, experiencing things they'd not seen before. Cole articulated this beautifully in his essay on American scenery, saying, let him, that is the traveler, be transported to those favored regions where the features of the earth are more varied. The delight, that is the sensation that a man experiences, is not merely sensual or selfish that passes with the occasion, leaving no trace behind, but in gazing on the pure creations of the Almighty, he feels a calm religious tone steal through his mind, elevate his mind. And when he's turned to mingle with his fellow men, the chords which have been struck in that sweet communion cease not to vibrate. In other words, the experience also is characterized by remaining in memory. So experience is profound. It begins with sensation. It leads to an elevation of mind and spirit, and it's preserved in the memory. Cole's views of this were coupled by his scathing indictments of the indifference with which the multitude regards the beauties of nature. Here's a wonderful painting of the era in which we see the people who are on the grand tour spending all of their time reading their guidebooks and none of their time looking at the landscape. Cole, on the other hand, plumped for direct, unfiltered sensory experience. In other words, experience that is so direct that nothing filters it. It comes in without any interference and leads to elevation and loss of memory. And this particular wonderful painting of Cole's of the Catskill Mountain House and the two lakes gives a feel for exactly what Cole was talking about when he made those observations. The question then arose, was it not perhaps the case that Cole himself had a direct experience at Pompeii that led to his views of what to do with the rooms? And indeed, there had been a great change in excavations at Pompeii around the time that Cole visited there. Instead of visitors seeing only temples, for the first time there were excavated domestic interiors and people actually saw Roman houses. However, in Cole's case, what I discovered when I went through all of his drawings at the Detroit Institute of Art was that Cole made absolutely no sketches, either on site or from memory, of any Pompeian interiors or decorations or aspects of those interiors. We know from all of his other work that he always worked from sketches. He was a veritable sketching machine who drew every day, and yet, though there are some exteriors done at those ancient Roman cities, not a single interior detail appears to have been recorded. He did sketch one blue Pompeian peacock, however. Moreover, Cole owned John Gollicott's 1825 Specimens of Ancient Decorations from Pompeii, which would have been a book that he could have borrowed from. But it turns out, when we look at Cedar Grove, now that we know what was there in all of the rooms, he borrowed nothing from it. So what was the starting point for this particular concept? I believe that the starting point itself was actually Alexander Thompson's room, or what we knew as Alexander Thompson's room. It made a perfect starting point for reconceiving the interior of Cedar Grove because it required only the changing of the walls. There was a carpet in the room that could be preserved, reused, recycled with the wall painting. And better yet, the work on this room wasn't linked in any way to work on other rooms. He didn't have to wait to finish something else to start it. He could really begin immediately. And I believe he did. The question is, how was the room to be used? The inventory of Thomas Thompson's belongings taken in September 1821 after his death shows that the initial furnishings of this room were not those of a bedroom, but in fact the furnishings of a library. And in interviews with Edith Cole Silverstein, Thomas Cole's last really living descendant with experience of the house, she told me that we called that room the bookless library. In other words, the family continued to think of the room as a library, but somehow it managed to be a library without having any books in it. How, I thought, could that be? Were there examples of other kinds of libraries in which things other than books were featured? And I quickly realized that indeed there were, though not so much in the US as in the United Kingdom. There was definitely a history in England of libraries which also were repositories for family portraits, sculpture, and other kinds of art. Libraries in this tradition were more than books. They were cultural centers. Here's an example of a library that includes multiple works of art, a piano, and of course, lots and lots of books. A bookless library would in fact be a gallery, and a library as a gallery is a very potent kind of room because it links the beautiful in the form of art with the good in the form of the rational knowledge to be learned from books. In other words, you could say that the definition of a library in a domestic interior would then be a room that's dedicated to imaginative experience and to elevation and to memory, very much related to thoughts about scenery. And in this picture, we see two children who are obviously benefiting from a library. It's possible, therefore, that the idea of forming a family and having children may have helped to inspire Cole's desire to create a library that included more than books at Cedar Grove. We know quite a lot of the chronology of Cole's experience potentially with libraries. In 1829 to 31, he visited England. He was on a grand tour and spent actually by far the largest amount of his time in England. Immediately after returning from England, he listed himself as an architect in the New York City commercial directory. So something had happened during that visit, during that time, that caused him to think of himself as a designer of buildings or of interiors. And is probably not coincidental, I will go on to argue, that he shortly afterward put together some ideas that became the essay on American scenery. So if we then assume, which I think we can, that Cedar Grove's Red Library would have been done after Cole's marriage, but before his work on the other rooms, it was presumably being worked on around 1836. And interestingly, by 1838, when he was working in the West Parlor, he was actually entering a design competition for the Ohio State House, and obviously thinking very much more about buildings than he had before. In 1829, when Cole went to London, he was seeing it for the first time. He had grown up on the western side of the country in a rural area and had never seen anything quite like London before. The question becomes, what did he see there? Can we see what Cole saw? Can we go where he went? Can we visit where he visited? Do we have any idea what it is that happened to him in London that led to his becoming interested in building interiors and architecture? Cole reached London at a point in which one major feature of interior decoration was collection. Because of the grand tour and the interest in experience, there was much interest in collecting objects. And some of the major collectors had begun themselves to work on interiors. Thomas Hope, who was a banker, but also a collector and author and designer of furniture and interiors, had vast collections and spent a great deal of thought on thinking of ways to have them recall and evoke experience. He designed interiors to showcase his collections, and he published his designs, which were quite influential. The domestic setting for collectors like Hope was the domestic interior for collectors like Hope was a setting for their collections that recalled experience, evoked experience. One collector of great significance who we know Cole spent time with was Sir Thomas Lawrence, or sometimes spelled Lawrence. Lawrence was the head of the National Academy of Art at the time that Cole visited in London, and despite Cole's sometimes complaints that painters in London were not friendly and open to him, Lawrence invited him to his home, which presumably was something of a revelation. Cole saw there a lot of paintings by Lawrence and was understandably impressed by the work of probably the greatest portraitist of his time. But he also saw Lawrence's painting room, which was actually furnished in a neoclassical style, even though it was a working painting room. And Lawrence had also created what he called his private sitting room. The private sitting room was like no private sitting room we've ever seen before or since. First of all, there was very little to sit on in it, but there was a great deal to see there. And what was notable was that not only had Lawrence filled the room with things that he had collected, but he had also incorporated his own portraits into the contents of the room. So that in effect, by taking the idea of collection and displaying collections and weaving his own work into it, he suggested that his work was on a par with the great artists of antiquity. And that lesson could not have been lost on his sitters or the public as a whole. Cole would later say in his essay on American Scenery that there is in the human mind an almost inseparable connection between the beautiful and the good. What he meant by that was that beautiful design, for example, or beautiful art, stimulates imagination, and then imagination then in turn stirs the rational mind, which is the moral faculty. Cole became interested prior to his trip to London in the work of J.M.W. Turner. And Turner, like Lawrence, kindly invited Cole to visit him. This may have been a very formative kind of encounter because Turner had once thought of becoming an architect and was extremely interested in architecture. He designed a house for himself called Sandycombe Lodge, which still exists, and which was very beautifully and carefully designed. He took a great interest in interiors, and his interest in interiors extended to the creation of a gallery, private gallery, that he used for marketing work that he could not display in the large shows in London. This space was very influential for a lot of people who saw it, and it certainly would have suggested to Cole the opportunity to display saleable art in a domestic interior. More important, perhaps, than any of these connections were the two brothers who became Thomas Cole's closest English friends. The banker and collector Henry Rogers was enormously kind to Cole, who spent great amounts of time with him and with Rogers at home. Rogers had a brother, Samuel Rogers, who was a very, very well-known poet, an absolutely crazed art collector, and a bon vivant of international proportions. Here we see Rogers in the process of discoursing upon a painting, which was something he was extremely well qualified to do. He was a connoisseur. Rogers, influenced by his brother Henry, invited Cole to visit his spectacular house at the Green Park, which fronted on the Green Park, and which contained the most incredible collection of objects and art assembled by anyone. When Rogers's collections were sold in the 1850s, they brought more than 45,000 pounds, which was an astronomical amount of money. The sale of his collections and books went on for 9 full days. However, there was more to Rogers' approach to interiors than simply collection. He had a great interest in art and neoclassicism because of a trip to Italy that had made a profound effect on him. And his close friend, John Flaxman, who was an industrial designer, but also a draftsman and a sculptor, had collaborated with him on creating the interior of the house that Rogers invited Cole to visit. This is one of its mantels by Flaxman. The house was quite extraordinary, and George Gordon, known to us as Lord Byron, visited and said, On all objects of taste, his delicacy, that is Rogers' delicacy of expression, is as pure as his poetry. If you enter his house, his drawing room, his library, you of yourself say, this is not the dwelling of a common mind. There is not a gem, a coin, a book thrown aside on his chimney piece, his sofa, his table, that does not bespeak an almost fastidious elegance in the possessor. The carefully conceived interiors that Flaxman and Rogers created together were intended to incorporate all of these exquisite objects and beautifully selected items into one entire coherent interior that was really quite seamless. This is a view of his drawing room, which has furniture with Roman stripes on it, Roman striped covers on it, sculptures by Flaxman, rare works of art on the wall, a neoclassical carpet on the floor. The most famous room in Rogers' house was his breakfast room, because he held very, very famous entertainments there, where he invited people who were interested in art and ideas to come for breakfast. They came to a designed interior that was hung very strategically with landscapes. And the idea was that they would have an imaginative experience with the art in the room, and here you can see them, the guests appreciating it, but that this would also inspire rational discourse and lead to intellectual and moral improvement. Ideas very much in sync with the ones that Cole himself later expressed. The neoclassical interiors that Rogers lived in, neoclassical rooms, were actually picturesque experiences. They were not simply rationally ordered, but were assemblages of art and design intended to convey very specific experiences. Rogers himself wrote his poetry at a table, which can be seen on the right there, with paintings that particularly moved him hung about him. At the end of the room was a vase that was so famously associated with this room and with Rogers that it appears in every view of Rogers's breakfast room, regardless of whether it's at one end of the room or the other. It seems to move about depending upon the artist's view, but it's never there, nevertheless there is the signature. The other signature is the magnificent view of the Green Park seen through the windows at the end of the room. These windows actually opened as if they were doors, and you could step out onto a sort of piazza beyond. Interestingly enough, this was a device that would have been very familiar to Cole, who already knew Cedar Grove well. As you know, the house in its most important rooms has similar windows which simultaneously have picturesque views and can be raised and lowered and used for ingress and egress. This artist rendering of the breakfast room shows another powerfully important aspect of Rogers's interior. As you can see, the windows and the works of art blend together very seamlessly. The idea expressed, or that's implicit in this, is that paintings are views and views are art, and that the two are inextricably intertwined and operate on the same principles. Though the painting is somewhat faded, the actual color of the wall was what we can see next to this little bit, the knee that I lifted out of the other picture, a color that became, that came to be used in another version in the West Parlor at Cedar Grove, along with the strategy of intermingling the views, that is to say the windows, with the pictures. At present, we have a mirror hanging over the mantel, but as designed by Cole, The room featured the windows with the views, and then as you moved around the room, major works by Cole. And the intimation again was that the scenery in the form of the paintings and the scenery exterior to the house were one and the same. Cole would express this idea very directly in a source where we forget he has said anything of the kind, namely his essay on American scenery. In it, he says, punning, "I have alluded to wild and uncultivated scenery," that is, until picturesque landscape, "but the cultivated scenery, that is, cultivated, improved by education or taste or training, must not be forgotten, for it is still more important to man in his social capacity, necessarily bringing him in contact with the cultured. It encompasses our homes, and though devoid of the stern sublimity of the wild, its quieter spirit, which is to say its beauty, steals tenderly into our bosoms, mingled with 1,000 domestic affections and heart-touching associations. And it is here that taste, which is the perception of the beautiful, and the knowledge of the principles on which nature works, can be applied, and our dwelling places made fitting for refined and intellectual beings." This concept of cultivated scenery would be critical to Cole's thinking. I think it was critical to his shift into an interest in interior architecture, and it is certainly expressed in his work at Cedar Grove. As he says, "I've alluded to wild and uncultivated scenery, but the cultivated must not be forgotten." In other words, I've talked about wild scenery, but the kind of visual experience that we create by taste and refinement is still more important even to man in his social capacity. Rogers would certainly have agreed, and his home bears the number of interesting affinities with Cole's work at Cedar Grove, in addition to the ones I've already mentioned. His library was painted Pompeian red, like Cole's library. And Rogers' library was an extraordinary, absolute cabinet of wonders. The frieze along the top of the room was made of various kinds of ancient Roman and Greek vessels. Rare paintings were hung over the books using a very clever hanging system so that the viewer could move about the room as if he were in an ancient Roman room, seeing image after image after image. Both a library as a gallery and a library as a place for shelving books. Similar ideas were expressed by yet another friend of this group. All of these men who were kind to Cole and receptive to Cole knew each other and worked together and were close. Sir John Sohn, arguably the most successful architect of his time, had an extraordinary house in which he too created a red Pompeian library, very different in appearance from one at Cedar Grove or the one at Rogers's home, but the affinities nevertheless are clear, not only the color, but the combination of art with books. And in Sohn's case, a very kind of literal and obvious emphasis on ways of seeing and ways of provoking the imagination. Mirrors that show areas that you would not otherwise see, painting on ceilings in order to create a sort of total surround visual adventure, and so forth. What Sohn had shown in his own home and also in his other projects was that interior design creates and controls direct visual experience, that it is actually a way of creating the kind of of direct visual experience that Cole was thinking about when he was thinking about scenery, and which he was also thinking about when he was thinking about cultivated scenery. In this particular print, there's an interesting combination here of the cultivated scenery of the Catskill Mountain House and the appreciation of the external scenery by the visitors who are pointing at the sites. As Cole said, I have alluded to wild and uncultivated scenery, but the cultivated must not be forgotten, for it is still more important to man in his social capacity, necessarily bringing him in contact with the cultured. It encompasses our homes, and though devoid of the stern sublimity of the wild, its quieter spirit steals tenderly into our bosoms, mingled with 1,000 domestic affections and heart-touching associations. And it's here that taste, which is the perception of the beautiful, and the knowledge, the knowledge of the principles on which nature works can be applied. This, I think, was the aim at Cedar Grove. Cole went on to say, also in the essay on American scenery, the Hudson has its wooded mountains, its rugged precipices, its green undulating shores, a natural majesty and an unbounded capacity for improvement by art. Its shores are not besprinkled with venerated ruins or the palaces of princes, but there are flourishing towns and neat villas, and the hand of taste has already been at work. Without any great stretch of the imagination, we may anticipate the time when the ample waters shall reflect temple and tower and dome in every variety of picturesqueness and magnificence, which could only make us think of Olana, of this house that Cole was designing for himself and his family, of the nature of cultivated scenery, which improves and enters the memory just as wild scenery does. Cultivated scenery, I believe, is what we have at Cedar Grove between 1836 and 1848. And that cultivated scenery is a priceless souvenir of Thomas Cole's grand tour. Now I'd like to turn things over to Betsy so that we can take some questions and have some discussion. Thank you, and I look forward to hearing your thoughts.
Hi, everyone. Thanks, Jean. That was quite amazing. That tour of all those beautiful places makes me want to travel again. So we have the opportunity to ask Jean some questions, and you can do that by using the Q&A feature on your screen. If you move your cursor down to the bottom, if you're on a desktop, the Q&A button should appear there, and if you click on it, a window will pop up where you can type your questions. So I invite anyone who has some questions for Jean to go ahead and submit them, and then I'll read them out loud to Jean. So one thing that I was wondering is, it seems that Thomas Cole saw a lot of his Italian Pompeian influences in London, and that's a place where he really fell in love with the Pompeian designs rather than in Pompeii. I mean, do you agree? And what would you say about that?
Oh, no, I think that's absolutely right. And I think it explains certain odd things, such as his not making any effort to sketch the interiors of Roman houses that he saw. I think that was where he fell in love with it, and that the visit that he made, I mean, he loved Italy. He had a fantastic time there, but I think his visits to ancient Roman architecture just kind of, that was sort of the capstone, you know, it just finished off the experience that had been started back in London,
Yeah.
rather than being the initiating point.
Right. That's only when he saw it there. All right, so we have a bunch of questions piling up. Linda Yowell asks, are you investigating clues to other original interior finishes and details in the east and west parlors aside from the wonderful friezes. So the other original interior finishes and details in those parlors.
Might need a little clarification on that. I've been looking at all of the surfaces of all of the rooms. So in addition to what was discovered on the walls, we've also looked very closely at the trim, and of course, information about the soft furnishings in the room. So every aspect of the room really has been studied or is in the process of being studied. I don't know if that completely answers the question as it's phrased, but that's okay.
Yeah, I can elaborate on that too. And that Jean has written us a huge historic furnishings and finishes report that documents all of the objects, the furnishings that were in the room originally, whether we own them or don't, and if we don't own them, where they are, as well as the original carpet type and colors and everything. So it's really an amazing body of research. We call her the forensic decorator because she can find all this evidence without photography of that room in Cole's time. It just simply wasn't, that technology wasn't really available or used. So let's see, we have here, would Jean like to surmise which of Cole's paintings he might have hung in the Pompeian Red bookless library? For those of you out there who are familiar with Cole's paintings, it'd be a fun exercise to think about rehanging them in that room.
It would be a very fun exercise and very interesting to speculate about. One very real possibility is that things came and went in that room, that there were things displayed there that he wanted to display, and then they went away and were replaced by other things. It is also the case, there is no time in this very compressed talk to get into this, but one of the most important influences of Roman interiors in this particular instance is on the idea of presenting paintings as images that cause you to remember things. And consequently, there's a great interest in sequences of paintings or series of paintings. So it's tempting to imagine that in some cases, Cole, who was very interested in series and sequences, might have shown works of that sort there. Now, I did show a diagram of that room, and there were areas that were blocked out in orange. Those are areas that were penetrations in the room. So one of the things I was interested in looking at the room initially is how much wall area did it actually have? How much room for furniture did it actually have? And there was almost no room for furniture, which tends to support the bookless library theme. But there were some continuous walls there, you know, where he could have put things. So I don't know if we will ever be able to establish that, but I think it's pretty clear that the gallery function was what he was after, you know, in that setting.
Jean, when you say there were penetrations in the wall, do you mean that you could figure out where he put a nail in the wall so that you could hang a painting there? Like,
no, doors and windows.
Oh, okay.
If you look at that room, it's a very funny room. It doesn't have a fireplace. It doesn't have a mantle taking space, but it has a lot of, if you add together the doors and windows, it has a lot of spaces in it that were not good for anything except going in and out. So there was a real limitation to what, you know, could be done. And that probably also, you know, contributed to the idea of hanging things there. It was possible to do, you know, and very possibly the definition of the room wasn't changed. It remained a library, but the definition of library was changed.
Yeah, well, at this, I think this very month, we're painting the walls that red color. They've frieze at the top has been completely uncovered, the Greek key meander frieze, and then restored in places so you can see the original vibrancy. And then the wall color, I think, is going on this month. So we will, when we reopen, we'll get to show everybody this beautiful new room.
Yes, yes. And Margaret Seliski has done an amazing job of conservation there. So, you know, you definitely want to see the results of her really meticulous and inspired work there. It's really, that room is perhaps more thoroughly transformed than any of the others, simply because it was in our thinking sort of a nothing. You know, we just didn't
we didn't know it was all lurking there. Yeah. Okay, a couple more questions. So one person, an anonymous question, what was the significance of the mirrors in the interior design? They appeared in a lot of different rooms, and we're wondering if that also had some deep symbolism like the other things did.
Well, it isn't so much symbolism as it is working with the idea that a room is a three-dimensional visual experience, and that what design does is to give us visual experiences. And one of the things that happens with things like parabolic mirrors and so forth is that they give us visual experiences that we couldn't have had any other way. And Sohn is very famous for that sort of thing, but he wasn't the only one. You know, there was a lot of that in Turner's house, for example, Sandycombe Lodge. And, you know, it was something that people were interested in generally. But I think the circle of people that Cole, well, you could almost say he blundered into it. He happened into it. He fortunately wandered into it. That group of people, those men, all were interested in experimenting with different kinds of visual experience. In some ways, it's an era that's very like the 1960s in that respect. You know, like, can we have different ways of seeing and look at things differently and be surprised by the way things look? And there was, you know, a lot of that going on.
Yeah, well, it certainly explains this. When we first discovered the borders, the painted borders in these parlors, we just thought, what on earth? You know, it seemed to come out of nowhere. There was nothing like it in the Northeast U.S. On the walls at that early time. And so it was really, as you say, from his travels elsewhere.
Yeah.
So, here's one. How did the Cole papers end up in Detroit? I can take that one if you don't know that one, Jean.
They actually ended up there via Edith Cole Silverstein. And there is a massive archive of Cole material there. If you're interested, you can go on the website of the Detroit Institute of Art, DIA, because a lot of it is digitized, which is really wonderful. You can just get it up on your screen and look at it. And it was that group of things on paper was very interesting to me because it covered the period of Cole's travels. So, you know, I was trying to find out what happened to him, you know, what happened to him creatively, imaginatively, mentally. And because he was such a manic sketcher, his sketchbooks really tend to kind of document those things. So I wanted to see, you know, in particular, of course, what he was doing when he went to Pompeii and Herculaneum and Paestum. And of course, the answer was practically nothing. No.
But I mean, the Detroit Institute, of course, has taken extraordinarily good care of these fragile paper objects. We don't know what would have happened to them if they had stayed in the house during the time that it was just a family home. And but the story is that I've heard is that the curator from Detroit was in the area and had driven across country to see Frederick Church's home and stopped by the Cole house and said to Edith or Florence, I think it was Edith, I'll take every piece of paper in this house, you know, and here's some money. And she said, great. She said,
Yes.
great, take it all. And so he packed it into his car and drove it to Detroit. And at that time, I guess they didn't think it would be worth anything. Of course, we'd love to have an archive of it back if they were ever interested in deaccessioning it. But that's the story. He packed it into his car. So,
yeah, and I think potentially we have access to it, you know, working with them. We could potentially have a privileged digital access, which would also be very good. There are lots of other things there too. There are journals and records, and you know, it's written materials as well as sketched. But yeah, pretty incredible.
Amazing. And Ken Myers has done an extraordinary job of really studying it and doing great work out there. So it's really fallen into good hands. That's the good news.
Now, one thing I did find there that was very exciting is I did find the prototype for the bird in the carpet. In other words, that was, you know, that drawing was there. So that certainly nails that connection.
That peacock.
Yeah, the peacock.
Yeah, so that's really interesting. So Jean, when she visited Thomas Cole's house, before any of this interior decoration was implemented, discovered that this carpet fragment on Thomas Cole's sketching chair, the one he sat in when he painted the little details on his paintings, that it had been recovered in a piece of carpet, and that this carpet was the exact match of the descriptions that we had for the west parlor carpet. So it was quite a find, and this carpet was a very unusual pattern. We'd never seen anything. You'd never seen anything. John Burroughs, the carpet expert, never seen anything like it. So there was this speculation that maybe Cole designed this thing, because it really is, it's odd. I mean, it has this sort of stepped pyramid and this huge red peacock, and it's you know, to my untrained eye, very unusual. And so it's interesting that he made a sketch. So maybe does that really confirm that
I think
designed this thing?
Yeah, I think it takes it from, you know, the sort of 60% realm of speculation to maybe 80%, 85%. I mean, it's really a very, very strong indication. There are other signs and signals that very possibly he could have designed this. The carpet, it was a very unusual width. Very unusual, which to me said that it was actually an American manufacturer, that it was actually woven in a US mill at the point when they're just beginning to weave looped pile Brussels carpet. So, you know, Cole had plenty of opportunity to interact with representatives of these mills. They had storefronts in New York City. He went to New York City, he was there for an extended period of time, and he came home with a carpet. So given the peacock drawing, I think there's a very, very strong possibility that he was the perpetrator. And also, we should also mention that the nature of the graphics of the motif in the carpet is very, very closely related to the drawing of printed calico fabric, which is what Cole trained to design. In other words, the carpet looks like a calico, and calico is where he started. So that too, I think, makes it look as if he decided to try his hand at carpet design. Now it's interesting because from that forward, when he then acquired carpets for elsewhere in the house, he did not design them himself. So it's possible that he realized his limitations.
Yeah, interesting. Well, yeah, one of our visitors' favorite and most frequently commented on aspects of the decor is that carpet with the red peacock. It's quite something.
Yes.
And so our next question, Estee O'Connor says, did Cole presumably design any interiors specifically tied to an individual painting? So for example, on delivering a painting to a patron with instructions for the interior design to go with it. You know, for example, this must be hung with south light on a red wall, etc.
Yes, the answer to that is yes. Lumen Reed, you know, the course of empire, and actually this is one of the things that early on, you know, became important in our thinking. The course of empire was initially in Cole's mind a much vaster and more ambitious and infinitely more expensive project than Lumen Reed eventually paid for. But as we know, and as the Cole site is well aware, he sent Reed a diagram showing him how the paintings should be hung, how they would be spaced on the wall, and specifying that they should be hung either against a red wall or a green wall. And he also, interestingly enough, suggested that it would be possible also in the room to incorporate other paintings if you put the pictures on wings. And that, to me, is a very interesting observation because Sir John Sohn hung paintings on wings, and Rogers was using a somewhat similar hanging method in some parts of the breakfast room. So it may be that, you know, in the thinking about how his series, how the course of empire should be displayed, that he was thinking quite specifically of the kinds of experiences he'd had in England and wanting to very much specify what that should look like. Now, he also was deeply involved in designing painted doors for that gallery, and, you know, painted some panels himself. Others were painted by other artists, but every indication is that he was actually the mastermind behind the decorative scheme. And very possibly, you know, he talked with Reed about his background as a designer. I mean, Reed was in the textile business. You know, Shirley Cole would have said to him, I trained as a designer of textiles, et cetera, et cetera. So the answer to that is yes. Unfortunately, it doesn't survive. So, I mean, so far as we know, Cedar Grove is the only example still standing, you know, of various ideas that Cole had about, you know, designing interiors and incorporating pictures into them.
Well, we're bumping up now against 3 o'clock, so I think that's about all we have time for questions. But I wanted to take this opportunity to thank you so much, Jean, for all the work that you've done on discovering what was going on in Cole's house and inside it. And again, thank Carrie for leading us down this path and introducing us to you. And also, I'd like to thank the Humanities New York grant that we received to support this program, as well as the National Endowment for the Humanities, the New York State Council on the Arts, with the support of Governor Cuomo and the New York State Legislature, the Empire State Development's I Love New York program under the Market New York initiative, and a very special thank you to all of you out there, the Kindred Spirits Society of the Thomas Cole National Historic Site, which is really a bedrock of our operations. So thank you all. Thank you to all of you out there for listening, and I hope you'll join us next month. On February 7th, we have a special speaker, Elan Cook-Lee, who's going to talk about her work with hundreds of historic sites across the country on the development of slavery programs that center Black humanity. And that's a topic that we are working closely with, and so many other historic sites are working to develop those types of programs. So I'm really looking forward to hearing about the work that she has done. So thank you again, and good afternoon. Goodbye from the Hudson Valley.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.